Chapter 5. The Roman World Empire.
Chapter Outline and Focus Questions. Early Rome and the Republic. What policies and institutions help explain the Roman success in conquering Italy? How did Rome achieve its empire from 264 to 133 BCE, and what problems did Rome face as a result of its growing empire? The Roman Empire at its height. What were the chief features of the Roman Empire at its height in the 2nd century CE? Crisis in the late Empire. What reforms did Diocletian and Constantine institute, and to what extent were the reforms successful? What role did the Germanic tribes play in the late Roman Empire? Transformation of the Roman world, the development of Christianity. What characteristics of Christianity enabled it to grow and ultimately to triumph as the official religion of the Roman Empire? A comparison of the Roman and Han Empire. In what ways were the Roman Empire and the Han Chinese Empire similar, and in what ways were they different? Critical thinking. Compare and contrast the Roman Empire and Han Chinese Empire in regard to dynastic rule, bureaucratic government, trade, the military, and imperial expansion. Connections to today. What lessons does the fall of the Roman Republic offer to the United States today? At the beginning of the first millennium CE, almost 50% of the world's population lived in one of two mighty world empires, the Han and Roman Empire. They were the largest political entities the world had yet seen. The Han Empire extended from Central Asia to the Pacific Ocean. The Roman Empire encompassed the lands around the Mediterranean, parts of the Middle East, and Western and Central Europe. Although there were no diplomatic contacts between the two civilizations, the two great empires were linked commercially. Roman history is the remarkable story of how a group of Latin-speaking people, who established a small community on a plain called Latium in central Italy, went on to conquer all of Italy and then the entire Mediterranean world. Why were the Romans able to do this? Scholars do not really know all the answers, but the Romans had their own explanation. Early Roman history is filled with legendary tales of the heroes who made Rome great. One of the best known is the story of Horatius at the bridge. Threatened by attack from the neighboring Etruscans, Roman farmers abandoned their fields and moved into the city, where they would be protected by the walls. One weak point in the Roman defenses, however, was a wooden bridge over the Tiber River. Horatius was on guard at the bridge when a sudden assault by the Etruscans caused many Roman troops to throw down their weapons and flee.
Horatius urged them to make a stand at the bridge. When they hesitated, he told them to destroy the bridge behind him while he held the Etruscans back.
Astonished at the sight of a single defender, the confused Etruscans threw their spears at Horatius, who caught them on his shield and barred the way. By the time the Etruscans were about to overwhelm the lone defender, the Roman soldiers had brought down the bridge. Horatius then dived fully armed into the water and swam safely to the other side through a hail of arrows. Rome had been saved by the courageous act of a Roman who knew his duty and was determined to carry it out. Courage, duty, determination, these qualities would serve the many Romans who believed that it was their divine mission to rule nations and peoples. As one orator proclaimed, "By heaven's will my Rome shall be capital of the world." Early Rome and the Republic. Focus questions. What policies and institutions help explain the Romans' success in conquering Italy?
How did Rome achieve its empire from 264 to 133 BCE, and what problems did Rome face as a result of its growing empire?
Italy is a peninsula extending about 750 miles from north to south. It is not very wide, however, averaging about 120 miles across. The Apennines form a ridge down the middle of Italy that divides west from east. Nevertheless, Italy has some fairly large fertile plains that are ideal for farming.
Most important are the Po River Valley in the north, the plain of Latium, on which Rome was located, and Campania to the south of Latium.
To the east of the Italian peninsula is the Adriatic Sea, and to the west the Tyrrhenian Sea, bounded by the large islands of Corsica and Sardinia. Sicily lies just west of the toe of the boot-shaped Italian peninsula. Geography had an impact on Roman history. Although the Apennines bisected Italy, they were less rugged than the mountain ranges of Greece and did not divide the peninsula into small isolated communities. Italy also possessed considerably more productive agricultural land than Greece, enabling it to support a large population. Rome's location was favorable from a geographic perspective. Located 18 miles inland on the Tiber River, Rome had access to the sea and yet was far enough inland to be safe from pirates. Built on 7 hills, it was easily defended. Because the Tiber could be readily forded, Rome became a natural crossing point for north-south traffic in western Italy. All in all, Rome had a good central location in Italy from which to expand. Moreover, the Italian peninsula juts into the Mediterranean, making Italy an important crossroads between the western and eastern ends of the sea. Once Rome had unified Italy, involvement in Mediterranean affairs was natural. And after the Romans had conquered their Mediterranean empire, governing it was made easier by Italy's central location. Early Rome. According to Roman legend, Rome was founded by twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, in 753 BCE, and archaeologists have found that by around that time, a village of huts had been built on the tops of Rome's hills. The early Romans, basically a pastoral people, spoke Latin, which, like Greek, belongs to the Indo-European family of languages. The Roman historical tradition also maintained that early Rome, 753 to 509 BCE, had been under the control of 7 kings and that 2 of the last 3 had been Etruscans, people who lived north of Rome in Etruria. Historians believe that the king list may have some historical accuracy. What is certain is that Rome did fall under the influence of the Etruscans for about 100 years during the period of the kings, and that by the beginning of the 6th century, under Etruscan influence, Rome began to emerge as a city. The Etruscans were responsible for an outstanding building program. They constructed the first roadbed of the chief street through Rome, the Sacred Way, before 575 BCE. And oversaw the development of temples, markets, shops, streets, and houses. By 509 BCE, supposedly when the monarchy was overthrown and a republican form of government was established, a new Rome had emerged, essentially a result of the fusion of Etruscan and native Roman elements. The Roman Republic. The transition from monarchy to a republican government was not easy. Rome felt threatened by enemies from every direction and, in the process of meeting these threats, embarked on a military course that led to the conquest of the entire Italian peninsula. The Roman conquest of Italy. At the beginning of the Republic, Rome was surrounded by enemies, including the Latin communities on the plain of Latium. If we are to believe Livy, one of the chief ancient sources for the history of the early Roman Republic, Rome was engaged in almost continuous warfare with these enemies for the next 100 years. In his account, Livy provided a detailed narrative of Roman efforts.
Many of his stories were legendary in character. Writing in the 1st century BCE, he used his stories to teach Romans the moral values and virtues that had made Rome great.
This included tenacity, duty, courage, and especially discipline. By 338 BCE, Rome had crushed the Latin states in Latium. During the next 50 years, the Romans waged a successful struggle with hill peoples from central Italy and then came into direct contact with the Greek communities. The Greeks had arrived on the Italian peninsula in large numbers during the age of Greek colonization. Initially, the Greeks settled in southern Italy and then crept around the coast and up the peninsula. They also occupied the eastern 2/3 of Sicily. The Greeks had much influence on Rome.
They cultivated olives and grapes, passed on their alphabet, and provided artistic and cultural models through their sculpture, architecture, and literature. By 267 BCE, the Romans had completed the conquest of southern Italy by defeating the Greek cities.
After crushing the remaining Etruscan states to the north in 264 BCE, Rome had conquered most of Italy.
To rule Italy, the Romans devised the Roman Confederation in 338 BCE. Under this system, Rome allowed some peoples, especially the Latins, to have full Roman citizenship.
Most of the remaining communities were made allies.
They were free to run their own local affairs but were required to provide soldiers for Rome. Moreover, the Romans made it clear that loyal allies could improve their status and even have hope of becoming Roman citizens. The Romans had found a way to give conquered peoples a stake in Rome's success. In the course of their expansion throughout Italy, the Romans had pursued consistent policies that help explain their success. The Romans were superb diplomats who excelled in making the correct diplomatic decisions. While firm and even cruel when necessary, rebellions were crushed without mercy. They were also shrewd in extending their citizenship and allowing autonomy in domestic affairs. In addition, the Romans were not only good soldiers but also persistent ones. The loss of an army or a fleet did not cause them to quit but spurred them on to raise new armies and build new fleets. Finally, the Romans had a practical sense of strategy. As they conquered, the Romans established colonies, fortified towns, at strategic locations throughout Italy. By building roads to these settlements and connecting them, the Romans created an impressive communications and military network that enabled them to rule effectively and efficiently. By insisting on military service from the allies in the Roman Confederation, Rome essentially mobilized the entire military manpower of all Italy for its wars. The Roman state, after the overthrow of the monarchy, Roman nobles, eager to maintain their position of power, established a republican form of government. The chief executive officers of the Roman Republic were the consuls and praetors. Two consuls, chosen annually, administered the government and led the Roman army into battle. The office of praetor was created in 366 BCE. The praetor was in charge of civil law as it applied to Roman citizens, but he could also lead armies and govern Rome when the consuls were away from the city.
As the Romans' territory expanded, they added another praetor to judge cases in which one or both people were non-citizens.
The Roman state also had a number of administrative officials who handled specialized duties, such as the administration of financial affairs and supervision of the public games of Rome.
The Roman Senate came to hold an especially important position in the Roman Republic. The Senate or Council of Elders was a select group of about 300 men who served for life. The Senate could only advise the magistrates, but this advice was not taken lightly and by the 3rd century BCE had virtually the force of law. The Roman Republic had a number of popular assemblies. By far the most important was the Centuriate Assembly. Organized by classes based on wealth, it was structured in such a way that the wealthiest citizens always had a majority. This assembly elected the chief magistrates and passed laws. Another assembly, the Council of the Plebs, came into being in 471 BCE. The Roman Republic, then, witnessed the interplay of three major elements. Two consuls and later other elected officials served as magistrates and ran the state. An assembly of adult males, the Centuriate Assembly, controlled by the wealthiest citizens, elected these officials, while the Senate, a small group of large landowners, advised them. Thus, the Roman state was an aristocratic republic controlled by a relatively small group of privileged people. The struggle of the orders, social divisions in the Roman Republic. The most noticeable element in the social organization of early Rome was the division between two groups, the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians were descendants of the original senators appointed during the period of the kings and were great landowners, who constituted an aristocratic governing class. Only they could be consuls, magistrates, and senators. Through their patronage of large numbers of dependent clients, they controlled the centuriate assembly and many other facets of Roman life. The plebeians constituted the considerably larger group of no-patrician large landowners, less wealthy landholders, artisans, merchants, and small farmers. Although they, too, were citizens, they did not have the same rights as the patricians. Both patricians and plebeians could vote, but only the patricians could be elected to governmental offices. Both had the right to make legal contracts and marriages, but intermarriage between patricians and plebeians was forbidden. At the beginning of the 5th century BCE, the plebeians began to seek both political and social equality with the patricians. The struggle between the patricians and plebeians dragged on for hundreds of years, but the plebeians ultimately were successful. The Council of the Plebs, a popular assembly for plebeians only, was created in 471 BCE, and new officials, known as tribunes of the plebs, were given the power to protect plebeians against arrest by patrician magistrates. A new law allowed marriages between patricians and plebeians, and in the 4th century BCE, plebeians were permitted to become consuls. Finally, in 287 BCE, the Council of the Plebs received the right to pass laws for all Romans. The struggle between the patricians and plebeians, then, had a significant impact on the development of the Roman state. Plebeians could now hold the highest offices of state, they could intermarry with the patricians, and they could pass laws binding on the entire Roman community. Theoretically, by 287 BCE, all Roman citizens were equal under the law, and all could strive for political office. But in reality, as a result of the right of intermarriage, a select number of patrician and plebeian families formed a new senatorial aristocracy that came to dominate the political offices. The Roman Republic had not become a democracy. The Roman conquest of the Mediterranean, 264 to 133 BCE. After their conquest of the Italian peninsula, the Romans found themselves face to face with a formidable Mediterranean power, Carthage. Founded around 800 BCE. On the coast of North Africa by Phoenicians, Carthage had flourished and assembled an enormous empire in the western Mediterranean. By the 3rd century BCE, the Carthaginian Empire included the coast of northern Africa, southern Spain, Sardinia, Corsica, and western Sicily. The presence the Romans apprehensive. In 264 BCE, the two powers began a lengthy struggle for control of the western Mediterranean. The Punic Wars. In the First Punic War, the Latin word for Phoenician was Punicus. The Romans resolved to conquer Sicily. The Romans, a land power, realized that they could not win the war without a navy and promptly developed a substantial naval fleet. After a long struggle, a Roman fleet defeated the Carthaginian navy off Sicily, and the war quickly came to an end. In 241 BCE, Carthage gave up all rights to Sicily and had to pay an indemnity. Sicily became the first Roman province. Carthage vowed revenge and extended its domains in Spain to compensate for the territory lost to Rome. When the Romans encouraged one of Carthage's Spanish allies to revolt against Carthage, Hannibal, the greatest of the Carthaginian generals, struck back, beginning the Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE. This time, the Carthaginian strategy aimed at bringing the war home to the Romans and defeating them in their own backyard.
Hannibal crossed the Alps with an army of 30,000 to 40,000 men and inflicted a series of defeats on the Romans.
At Cannae in 216 BCE, the Romans lost an army of almost 40,000 men. The Romans seemed on the brink of disaster but refused to give up, raised yet another army, and began to reconquer some of the Italian cities that had gone over to Hannibal's side. More important, the Romans pursued a strategy aimed at undermining the Carthaginian Empire in Spain. By 206 BCE, the Romans had pushed the Carthaginians out of Spain. The Romans then took the war directly to Carthage, forcing the Carthaginians to recall Hannibal from Italy. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, the Romans crushed Hannibal's forces, and the war was over. By the peace treaty signed in 201 BCE, Carthage lost Spain, which became another Roman province. Rome had become the dominant power in the western Mediterranean. 50 years later, the Romans fought their third and final struggle with Carthage.
A technical breach in the peace treaty gave the Romans the opportunity to carry out a policy advocated by a number of Romans, especially the conservative politician Cato, who ended every speech he made to the Senate with the words, "And I think Carthage must be destroyed."
In 146 BCE, Carthage was destroyed. For 10 days, Roman soldiers burned and pulled down all of the city's buildings. The inhabitants, 50,000 men, women, and children, were sold into slavery. The territory of Carthage became a Roman province called Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean. During its struggle with Carthage, Rome also had problems with the Hellenistic states in the Eastern Mediterranean, and after the defeat of Carthage, Rome turned its attention there. In 148 BCE, Macedonia was made a Roman province, and 2 years later, Greece was placed under the control of the Roman governor of Macedonia. In 133 BCE, the king of Pergamum deeded his kingdom to Rome, giving Rome its first province in Asia. Rome was now master of the Mediterranean Sea. The nature of Roman imperialism. Rome's empire was built in 3 stages: the conquest of Italy, the conflict with Carthage and expansion into the western Mediterranean, and the involvement with and domination of the Hellenistic kingdoms in the eastern Mediterranean. The Romans did not possess a master plan for the creation of an empire. Much of their expansion was opportunistic. Once involved in a situation that threatened their security, the Romans did not hesitate to act. And the more they expanded, the more threats to their security appeared on the horizon, involving them in yet more conflicts. Indeed, the Romans liked to portray themselves as declaring war only for defensive reasons or to protect allies. That is only part of the story, however. It is likely, as some historians have suggested, that at some point a group of Roman aristocratic leaders emerged who favored expansion both for the glory it offered and for the economic benefits it provided. Certainly, by the 2nd century BCE, aristocratic senators perceived new opportunities for lucrative foreign commands, enormous spoils of war, and an abundant supply of slave labor for their growing landed estates. By that same time, as the destruction of Carthage indicates, Roman imperialism had become more arrogant and brutal as well. Rome's foreign success also had enormous repercussions for the internal development of the Roman Republic. The Roman army. By the 4th century BCE, the Roman army consisted of 4 legions, each made up of 4,000 to 5,000 men. Each legion had about 300 cavalry and the rest infantry. In the early Republic, the army was recruited from citizens between the ages of 18 and 46 who had the resources to equip themselves for battle. Since most of them were farmers, they enrolled only for a year, campaigned during the summer months, and returned home in time for the fall harvest. Later, during the Punic Wars of the 3rd century BCE, the period of service had to be extended, although this was resisted by farmers whose livelihoods could be severely harmed by a long absence. Nevertheless, after the disastrous Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, the Romans were forced to recruit larger armies, and the number of legions rose to 25. Major changes in recruitment would not come until the 1st century BCE. With the military reforms of Marius. The decline and fall of the Roman Republic, 133 to 31 BCE. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Roman domination of the Mediterranean Sea was complete. Yet the process of creating an empire had weakened the internal stability of Rome, leading to a series of crises that plagued the Republic for the next 100 years. Growing inequality and unrest. By the 2nd century BCE, the Senate had become the effective governing body of the Roman state. It comprised 300 men, drawn primarily from the landed aristocracy. They remained senators for life and held the chief magistracies of the Republic. The Senate directed the wars of the 3rd and 2nd centuries and took control of both foreign and domestic policy, including financial affairs. Of course, these aristocrats formed only a tiny minority of the Roman people. The backbone of the Roman state and army had traditionally been the small farmers. But over time, many small farmers had found themselves unable to compete with large, wealthy landowners and had lost their lands. By taking over state-owned land and by buying out small peasant owners, these landed aristocrats had amassed large estates, called latifundia, that used slave labor. Thus, the rise of the latifundia contributed to a decline in the number of small farmers. Since the latter group traditionally provided the foundation of the Roman army, the number of men available for military service declined. Moreover, many of these small farmers drifted to the cities, especially Rome, forming a large class of landless poor. Some aristocrats tried to remedy this growing economic and social crisis. Two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, came to believe that the underlying cause of Rome's problems was the decline of the small farmer. To help the landless poor, they bypassed the Senate by having the Council of the Plebs pass land reform bills that called for the government to reclaim public land held by large landowners and to distribute it to landless Romans. Many senators, themselves large landowners whose estates included broad tracts of public land, were furious. A group of senators took the law into their own hands and murdered Tiberius in 133 BCE. 12 years later, Gaius suffered the same fate. The attempts of the Gracchus brothers to bring reforms had opened the door to further violence. Changes in the Roman army soon brought even worse problems. A new role for the Roman army. In the closing years of the 2nd century BCE, a Roman general named Marius began to recruit his armies in a new way. The Roman army had traditionally been a conscript army of small farmers who were landholders. Marius, who held the consulship from 104 to 100 BCE, recruited volunteers from both the urban and rural poor who possessed no property.
These volunteers swore an oath of loyalty to the general, not the Senate, and thus constituted a professional type army that might no longer be subject to the state.
Moreover, to recruit these men, the generals would promise them land, forcing the generals to play politics in order to get laws passed that would provide the land promised to their veterans. Marius had created a new system of military recruitment that placed much power in the hands of the individual generals. Lucius Cornelius Sulla was the next general to take advantage of the new military system. The Senate had given him command of a war in Asia Minor, but when the Council of the Plebs tried to transfer command of this war to Marius, a civil war broke out. Sulla won and seized Rome itself in 82 BCE, conducting a reign of terror to wipe out all opposition. Then Sulla restored power to the hands of the Senate and eliminated most of the powers of the popular assemblies. Sulla hoped that he had created a firm foundation for the traditional republic governed by a powerful Senate, but his real legacy was quite different from what he had intended. His example of using an army to seize power would prove most attractive to ambitious men. The collapse of the Republic. For the next 50 years, Roman history was characterized by two important features: the jostling for dominance of a number of powerful individuals and the civil wars generated by their conflicts. Three individuals came to hold enormous military and political power: Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar. Crassus was known as the richest man in Rome and led a successful military command against a major slave rebellion. Pompey had returned from a successful military command in Spain in 71 BCE and had been hailed as a military hero. Julius Caesar also had a military command in Spain. In 60 BCE, Caesar joined with Crassus and Pompey to form a coalition that historians call the First Triumvirate. Triumvirate means three-man rule. The combined wealth and influence of these three men was enormous, enabling them to dominate the political scene and achieve their basic aims. Pompey received a command in Spain, Crassus a command in Syria, and Caesar a special military command in Gaul, modern France. When Crassus was killed in battle in 53 BCE, his death left two powerful men with armies in direct competition. Caesar had conquered all of Gaul and gained fame, wealth, and military experience as well as an army of seasoned veterans who were loyal to him. When leading senators endorsed Pompey as the less harmful to their cause and voted for Caesar to lay down his command and return as a private citizen to Rome, Caesar refused. He chose to keep his army and moved into Italy illegally by crossing the Rubicon, the river that formed the southern boundary of his province. Caesar marched on Rome and defeated the forces of Pompey and his allies, leaving Caesar in complete control of the Roman government. Years later was named dictator for life. Realizing the need for reforms, he gave land to the poor and increased the Senate to 900 members. By filling it with many of his supporters and increasing the membership, he effectively weakened the power of the Senate. He also reformed the calendar by introducing the Egyptian solar year of 365 days. With later changes in 1582, it became the basis of our own calendar. Caesar planned much more in the way of building projects and military adventures in the East, but in 44 BCE, a group of leading senators assassinated him. Within a few years after Caesar's death, two men had divided the Roman world between them. Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, took the western portion and Antony, Caesar's ally and assistant, the eastern half. But the empire of the Romans, large as it was still too small for two masters, and Octavian and Antony eventually came into conflict.
Antony allied himself closely with the Egyptian queen, Cleopatra VII. At the Battle of Actium in Greece in 31 BCE, Octavian's forces smashed the army and navy of Antony and Cleopatra, who both fled to Egypt, where they committed suicide a year later.
Octavian, at the age of 32, stood supreme over the Roman world. The civil wars had ended. And so had the Republic. The Roman Empire at its height. Focus question: what were the chief features of the Roman Empire at its height in the 2nd century CE? With the victories of Octavian, peace finally settled on the Roman world. Although civil conflict still erupted occasionally, the new imperial state constructed by Octavian experienced remarkable stability for the next 200 years. The Romans imposed their peace on the largest empire established in antiquity. The age of Augustus, 31 BCE to 14 CE. In 27 BCE, Octavian proclaimed the restoration of the Republic. He understood that only traditional republican forms would satisfy the senatorial aristocracy. At the same time, Octavian was aware that the Republic could not be fully restored. Although he gave some power to the Senate, in fact, Octavian became the first Roman emperor. The Senate awarded him the title of Augustus, the revered one, a fitting title, in view of his power, that had previously been reserved for gods. Augustus proved highly popular, but the chief source of his power was his continuing control of the army. The Senate also gave Augustus the title of Imperator, or Commander-in-Chief. Imperator is Latin for our word emperor. Augustus maintained a standing army of 28 legions, or about 150,000 men. A legion was a military unit of about 5,000 troops. Only Roman citizens could be legionaries, while subject peoples could serve as auxiliary forces, which numbered around 130,000 under Augustus. Augustus was also responsible for setting up a Praetorian Guard of roughly 9,000 men who had the important task of guarding the emperor. Eventually, the Praetorian Guard would play a weighty role in making and deposing emperors. While claiming to have restored the Republic, Augustus inaugurated a new system for governing the provinces. Under the Republic, the Senate had appointed the governors of the provinces. Now certain provinces were given to the emperor, who assigned deputies known as legates to govern them. The Senate continued to name the governors of the remaining provinces, but the authority of Augustus enabled him to overrule the senatorial governors and establish a uniform imperial policy. Augustus also stabilized the frontiers of the Roman Empire. He conquered the Central and Maritime Alps and then expanded Roman control of the Balkan Peninsula up to the Danube River. His attempt to conquer Germany failed when 3 Roman legions, led by a general named Varus, were massacred in 9 CE by a coalition of German tribes. His defeats in Germany taught Augustus that Rome's power was not unlimited and also devastated him. For months, he would beat his head on a door, shouting, "Varus, give me back my legions." Augustus died in 14 CE. After dominating the Roman world for 45 years. He had created a new order while placating the old by restoring traditional values, a fitting combination for a leader whose favorite maxim was, "Make haste slowly." By the time of his death, his new order was so well established that few agitated for an alternative. Indeed, as the Roman historian Tacitus pointed out, practically no one had ever seen truly republican government. Political equality was a thing of the past. All eyes watched for imperial commands. The Republic was now only a memory, and given its last century of warfare, an unpleasant one at that. The new order was here to stay. The early empire, 14 to 180. There was no serious opposition to Augustus's choice of his stepson Tiberius as his successor. By his actions, Augustus established the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The next 4 successors of Augustus were related either to his own family or that of his wife, Livia. Several major tendencies emerged during the reigns of the Julio-Claudians, 14 to 68 CE. In general, more and more of the responsibilities that Augustus had given to the Senate tended to be taken over by the emperors, who also instituted an imperial bureaucracy, staffed by talented freedmen, to run the government on a daily basis. As the Julio-Claudian successors of Augustus acted more openly as real rulers rather than first citizens of the state, the opportunity for arbitrary and corrupt acts also increased. Nero, 54 to 68, for example, freely eliminated people he wanted out of the way, including his own mother, whose murder he arranged. Without troops, the senators proved unable to oppose these excesses, but the Roman legions finally revolted. Abandoned by his guards, Nero chose to commit suicide by stabbing himself in the throat after uttering his final words, "What an artist the world is losing in me." The 5 Good Emperors, 96 to 180. Many historians regard the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and the prosperity it engendered as the chief benefits of Roman rule during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. These benefits were especially noticeable during the reigns of the 5 so-called Good Emperors. These rulers treated the ruling classes with respect, maintained peace in the empire, and supported generally beneficial domestic policies. Though absolute monarchs, they were known for their tolerance and diplomacy. By adopting capable men as their sons and successors, the first 4 of these emperors reduced the chances of succession problems. Under the 5 Good Emperors, the powers of the emperor continued to expand at the expense of the Senate. Increasingly, imperial officials appointed and directed by the emperor took over the running of the government. The Good Emperors also extended the scope of imperial administration to areas previously untouched by the imperial government. Trajan, 98 to 117, implemented an alimentary program that provided state funds to assist poor parents in raising and educating their children. The good emperors were widely praised for their extensive building programs. Trajan and Hadrian, 117 to 138, were especially active in constructing public works, aqueducts, bridges, roads, and harbor facilities throughout the provinces and in Rome. Trajan built a new forum in Rome to provide a setting for his celebrated victory column. Hadrian's Pantheon, a temple of all the gods, is one of the grandest ancient buildings surviving in Rome. Frontiers in the provinces. Although Trajan extended Roman rule into Dacia, modern Romania, Mesopotamia, and the Sinai Peninsula, his successors recognized that the empire was overextended and returned to Augustus's policy of defensive imperialism. Hadrian withdrew Roman forces from much of Mesopotamia. Although he retained Dacia and Arabia, he went on the defensive in his frontier policy by reinforcing the fortifications along a line connecting the Rhine and Danube rivers and building a defensive wall 80 miles long across northern Britain to keep the Scots out of Roman Britain. By the end of the 2nd century, the Roman forces were established in permanent bases behind the frontiers. But when one frontier was attacked, troops had to be drawn from other frontiers, leaving them vulnerable to attack. At its height in the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire was one of the greatest states the world had seen. It covered about 3.5 million square miles and had a population, like that of China, estimated at more than 50 million. While the emperors and the imperial administration provided a degree of unity, considerable leeway was given to local customs, and the privileges of Roman citizenship were extended to many people throughout the empire. In 212, the Emperor Caracalla completed the process by giving Roman citizenship to every free inhabitant of the empire. Latin was the language of the western part of the empire, while Greek was used in the east. Roman culture spread to all parts of the empire and freely mixed with Greek culture, creating what has been called Greco-Roman civilization. The administration and cultural life of the Roman Empire depended greatly on cities and towns. A provincial governor's staff was not large, so it was left to local city officials to act as Roman agents in carrying out many government functions, especially those related to taxes. Most towns and cities were not large by modern standards. The largest was Rome, but there were also some large cities in the east. Alexandria in Egypt numbered more than 300,000 inhabitants. In the west, cities were usually small, with only a few thousand inhabitants. Cities were important in the spread of Roman culture, law, and the Latin language, and they resembled one another with their temples, markets, amphitheaters, and other public buildings. The process of Romanization in the provinces was reflected in significant changes in the governing classes of the empire. In the course of the 1st century, there was a noticeable decline in the number of senators from Italian families. By the end of the 2nd century, Italian senators made up less than 50% of the total. Increasingly, the Roman Senate was being recruited from wealthy provincial families. The provinces also provided many of the legionaries for the Roman army and, beginning with Trajan, supplied many of the emperors. Prosperity in the early empire, trade with China and India. The early empire was a period of considerable prosperity. Internal peace resulted in unprecedented levels of trade. Merchants from all over the empire came to the chief Italian ports of Puteoli on the Bay of Naples and Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber River. Long-distance trade beyond the Roman frontiers also developed during the early empire. Economic expansion in both the Roman and Chinese Empire helped foster the growth of this trade. Although both empires built roads chiefly for military purposes, the roads also came to facilitate trade. Moreover, By creating large empire, the Romans and Chinese not only established internal stability but also pacified bordering territories, thus reducing the threat that bandits posed to traders. As a result, merchants developed a network of trade routes that brought these two great empires into commercial contact. Most important was the Overland Silk Road, a regular caravan route between West and East. Silk, a filament recovered from the cocoons of silkworms, had been produced in China since the 4th millennium BCE. Eventually, knowledge of this special product reached the outside world, and Chinese silk exports began to rise. By the 2nd century BCE, the first clothing made from silk reached the Mediterranean Sea, stimulating the contacts between China and the Roman Empire. The bulk of the trade went overland through Central Asia, thus earning this route its modern name, the Silk Road. By the 1st century CE, large quantities of silk were being delivered to markets in Rome through the Silk Road trade. Silk became a craze among Roman elites, leading to a vast outflow of silver from Rome to China and causing the Roman scholar Pliny the Elder to remark that the Roman treasury was being depleted because wealthy Roman women were purchasing so much silk clothing. The silk trade also stimulated a degree of mutual curiosity between the two great empires but not much mutual knowledge. The Roman geographer Strabo wrote of a strange land called Sears, far to the east, while Chinese sources mention the empire of Great Qin at the far end of the Silk Road to the west. So far as is known, no personal or diplomatic contacts between the two civilizations ever took place. But two great empires at either extreme of the Eurasian supercontinent had for the first time been linked in a commercial relationship. After the takeover of Egypt in the 1st century CE, Roman merchants also began an active trade with India, from where they received precious pearls as well as pepper and other spices used in the banquets of the wealthy. The Romans even established a trading post in southern India where their merchants built warehouses and docks. Prosperity in the early empire, industry and farming. Increased trade helped stimulate manufacturing. The cities of the East still produced the items made in Hellenistic times. The first 2 centuries of the empire also witnessed the high point of industrial development in Italy. Some industries became concentrated in certain areas, such as bronze work in Capua and pottery in Arretium in Etruria. Other industries, such as brick making, were pursued in rural areas as byproducts of large landed estates. Despite the profits from trade and commerce, agriculture remained the chief pursuit of most people and the underlying basis of Roman prosperity. Although the large latifundia still dominated agriculture, especially in southern and central Italy, small peasant farms continued to flourish, particularly in Etruria and the Po Valley. Although large estates depended on slaves for the raising of sheep and cattle, the lands of some latifundia were also worked by free tenant farmers who paid rent in labor, produce, or sometimes cash. Despite the prosperity of the Roman world, an enormous gulf existed between rich and poor. The development of towns and cities, so important to the creation of any civilization, is based largely on the agricultural surpluses of the countryside. In ancient times, the margin of surplus produced by each farmer was relatively small. Therefore, the upper classes and urban populations had to be supported by the labor of a large number of agricultural producers, who never found it easy to produce much more than they needed for themselves. In lean years, when there were no surpluses, the townspeople often took what they wanted, leaving little for the peasants. Culture and society in the Roman world. One of the notable characteristics of Roman culture and society is the impact of the Greeks. Greek ambassadors, merchants, and artists traveled to Rome and spread Greek thought and practices. After their conquest of the Hellenistic kingdoms, Roman generals shipped Greek manuscripts and artworks back to Rome. Multitudes of educated Greek slaves labored in Roman households. Rich Romans hired Greek tutors and sent their sons to Athens to study. As the Roman poet Horace said, "Captive Greece took captive her rude conqueror." Greek thought captivated Roman minds, and the Romans became willing transmitters of Greek culture. Roman literature. The high point of Latin literature was reached in the age of Augustus, often called the Golden Age of Latin literature. The most distinguished poet of the Augustan age was Virgil, 70 to 19 BCE. The son of a small landholder in northern Italy, he welcomed the rule of Augustus and wrote his greatest work in the emperor's honor. Virgil's masterpiece was the Aeneid, an epic poem clearly intended to rival the work of Homer. The connection between Troy and Rome is made in the poem when Aeneas, a hero of Troy, survives the destruction of that city and eventually settles in Latium, establishing a link between Roman civilization and Greek history. Aeneas is portrayed as the ideal Roman. His virtues are duty, piety, and faithfulness.
Virgil's overall purpose was to show that Aeneas had fulfilled his mission to establish the Romans in Italy and thereby start Rome on its divine mission to rule the world.
Let others fashion from bronze more lifelike, breathing images, for so they shall, and evoke living faces from marble. Others excel as orators, others track with their instruments the planets circling in heaven and predict when stars will appear. But, Romans, never forget that government is your medium. Be this your art, to practice men in the habit of peace, generosity to the conquered, and firmness against aggressors. As Virgil expressed it, ruling was Rome's gift. Roman art. The Romans were also dependent on the Greeks for artistic inspiration. The Romans developed a taste for Greek statues, which they placed not only in public buildings but also in their private houses. The Romans' own portrait sculpture was characterized by an intense realism that included even unpleasant physical details. Wall paintings and frescoes in the homes of the rich realistically depicted landscapes, portraits, and scenes from mythological stories. The Romans excelled in architecture, a highly practical art. Although they continued to adapt Greek styles and made use of colonnades and rectangular structures, the Romans were also innovative. They made considerable use of curvilinear forms, the arch, vault, and dome.
The Romans were also the first people in antiquity to use concrete on a massive scale. By combining concrete and curvilinear forms, they were able to construct huge buildings, public baths, such as those of Caracalla, and amphitheaters capable of seating 50,000 spectators. These large buildings were made possible by Roman engineering skills. These same skills were put to use in constructing roads, aqueducts, and bridges. A network of 50,000 miles of roads linked all parts of the empire, and in Rome, almost a dozen aqueducts kept the population of 1 million supplied with water.
Roman law. One of Rome's chief gifts to the Mediterranean world of its day and to later generations was its system of law. Rome's first code of laws was the 12 Tables of 450 BCE. But that was designed for a simple farming society and proved inadequate for later needs. So, from the 12 tables, the Romans developed a system of civil law that applied to all Roman citizens. As Rome expanded, problems arose between citizens and non-citizens and also among non-citizen residents of the empire. Although some of the rules of civil law could be used in these cases, special rules were often needed. These rules gave rise to a body of law known as the Law of Nations, defined as the part of the law that applied to both Romans and foreigners. Under the influence of Stoicism, the Romans came to identify their Law of Nations with natural law, a set of universal laws based on reason. This enabled them to establish standards of justice that apply to all people. These standards of justice included principles that we would immediately recognize. A person was regarded as innocent until proved otherwise. People accused of wrongdoing were allowed to defend themselves before a judge. A judge, in turn, was expected to weigh evidence carefully before arriving at a decision. These principles lived on long after the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman family. At the heart of the Roman social structure stood the family, headed by the paterfamilias, the dominant male. The household also included the wife, sons with their wives and children, unmarried daughters, and slaves. Like the Greeks, Roman males believed that females needed male guardians. The paterfamilias exercised that authority. On his death, sons or nearest male relatives assumed the role of guardians. Fathers arranged the marriages of daughters. In the Republic, women married, with legal control, passing from father to husband. By the mid-1st century BCE, the dominant practice had changed to, without legal control, which meant that married daughters officially remained within the father's legal power. Since the fathers of most married women died sooner or later, not being in the legal control of a husband made possible independent property rights that forceful women could translate into considerable power within the household and outside it. Like the Greeks, the Romans did not always raise all the children born into their families. Not only were deformed children abandoned to die of exposure, but infant mortality rates were high. As many as half of all infants did not survive into childhood. Nevertheless, upper-class families did take good care of their surviving children. The father was largely responsible for providing for the education of his children. Roman boys learned reading and writing, moral principles and family values, law, and physical training to prepare them to be soldiers. Girls learned at home what they needed to know to be good wives and mothers. The end of childhood for Roman males came at the age of 16, when a young man exchanged his purple-edged toga for a plain white toga, the toga of manhood, and soon after began his career. For Roman girls, childhood ended at age 14, the common age of marriage. Although some Roman doctors warned that early pregnancies could be dangerous for young girls, early marriages persisted because women died at a relatively young age. A good example is Tullia, Cicero's beloved daughter. She was married at 16, widowed at 22, remarried 1 year later, divorced at 28, remarried at 29, and divorced at 33. She died at 34, which was not unusually young for women in Roman society. By the 2nd century CE, significant changes were occurring in the Roman family. The paterfamilias no longer had absolute authority over his children. He could no longer sell his children into slavery or have them put to death. Moreover, the husband's absolute authority over his wife had also disappeared, and by the late 2nd century, women were no longer required to have guardians. Upper-class Roman women in the early empire had considerable freedom and independence. They had acquired the right to own, inherit, and dispose of property. Upper-class women could attend races, the theatre, and events in the amphitheatre, although in the latter two places they were forced to sit in separate female sections. Women still could not participate in politics, but the early empire saw a number of important women who influenced politics through their husbands or sons, including Livia, the wife of Augustus, and Plotina, the wife of Trajan. Slaves and their masters. Although slavery was a common institution throughout the ancient world, no people possessed more slaves or relied so much on slave labor as the Romans eventually did. Slaves were used in many ways in Roman society. The rich owned the most and the best. In the late Roman Republic, it became a badge of prestige to be attended by many slaves. Greek slaves were in much demand as tutors, musicians, doctors, and artists. Roman businessmen would employ them as shop assistants or craftspeople. Slaves were also used as farm laborers. In fact, huge gangs of slaves worked the large landed estates under pitiful conditions. Many slaves of all nationalities were used as menial household workers, such as cooks, waiters, cleaners, and gardeners. Contractors used slave labor to build roads, aqueducts, and other public structures. The treatment of Roman slaves varied. There are numerous instances of humane treatment by masters and even reports of slaves who protected their owners from danger out of gratitude and esteem. But slaves were also subject to severe punishments, torture, abuse, and hard labor that drove some to run away, despite stringent laws against aiding a runaway slave. Some slaves revolted against their owners and even murdered them, causing some Romans to live in unspoken fear of their slaves. Near the end of the 2nd century BCE, large-scale slave revolts occurred in Sicily, where enormous gangs of slaves were subjected to horrible working conditions on large landed estates. The most famous uprising on the Italian peninsula occurred in 73 BCE. Led by a gladiator named Spartacus, the revolt broke out in southern Italy and involved 70,000 slaves. Spartacus managed to defeat several Roman armies before being trapped and killed in southern Italy in 71 BCE. 6,000 of his followers were crucified, the traditional form of execution for slaves. Imperial Rome. At the center of the colossal Roman Empire was the ancient city of Rome. A true capital city, Rome had the largest population of any city in the empire, close to 1 million by the time of Augustus. Only Chang'an, the imperial capital of the Han Empire in China, had a comparable population during this time. An enormous gulf existed between rich and poor in the city of Rome. While the rich had comfortable villas, the poor lived in apartment blocks called insulae, which might be 6 stories high. Constructed of concrete, they were often poorly built and prone to collapse. The use of wooden beams in the floors and movable stoves, torches, candles, and lamps for heat and light created a constant danger of fire. Once started, fires were extremely difficult to put out. The famous conflagration of 64, which Nero was unjustly accused of starting, devastated a good part of the city. Besides the hazards of collapse and fire, living conditions were miserable. High rents forced entire families into one room. In the absence of plumbing and central heating, conditions were so uncomfortable that poorer Romans spent most of their time outdoors in the streets. Though the center of a great empire, Rome was also a great parasite. Beginning with Augustus, the emperors accepted responsibility for providing food for the urban populace, with about 200,000 people receiving free grain. But even the free grain did not relieve the grim condition of the poor. Early in the 2nd century CE, a Roman doctor claimed that rickets was common among the city's children. In addition to food, entertainment was also provided on a grand scale for the inhabitants of Rome. The poet Juvenal said of the Roman marsers, "But nowadays, with no vote to sell, their motto is couldn't care less." Time was when their plebiscite elected generals, heads of state, commanders of legions, but now they've pulled in their horns. There's only 2 things that concern them: bread and circuses. The emperor and other state officials provided public spectacles as part of the great festivals, most of them religious in origin, celebrated by the state. The festivals included 3 major types of entertainment. At the Circus Maximus, horse and chariot races attracted hundreds of thousands, while dramatic and other performances were held in theaters. But the most famous of all the public spectacles were the gladiatorial shows. The gladiatorial shows. The gladiatorial shows were an integral part of Roman society. They took place in amphitheaters. Perhaps the most famous was the amphitheater known as the Colosseum, constructed in Rome to seat 50,000 spectators. In most cities and towns, amphitheaters were the biggest buildings, rivaled only by the circuses, arenas, for races and the public baths. Gladiatorial games were held from dawn to dusk. Contests to the death between trained fighters formed the central focus of these games, but the games included other forms of entertainment as well. Criminals of all ages and both genders were sent into the arena without weapons to face certain death from wild animals who would tear them to pieces. Numerous types of animal contests were also held, wild beasts against each other, such as bears against buffaloes, staged hunts with men shooting safely from behind iron bars, and gladiators in the arena with bulls, tigers, and lions. It is recorded that Emperor Titus inaugurated the Colosseum in 80 CE. These bloodthirsty spectacles were extremely popular with the Roman people. But the gladiatorial games served a purpose beyond mere entertainment. Like the other forms of public entertainment, the games fulfilled both a political and a social function. Certainly, the games served to divert the idle masses from political unrest. It was said of the Emperor Trajan that he understood that although the distribution of grain and money satisfied the individual, spectacles were necessary for the contentment of the masses. Disaster in southern Italy. Gladiatorial spectacles were contrived by humans, but the Roman Empire also experienced some spectacular natural disasters. One of the greatest was the eruption of Mount Vesuvius on August 24, 79 CE. Although known to be a volcano, Vesuvius was thought to be extinct, its hillsides green with flourishing vineyards. Its eruption threw up thousands of tons of lava and ash. Toxic fumes killed many people, and the nearby city of Pompeii was quickly buried under volcanic ash. To the west, Herculaneum and other communities around the Bay of Naples were submerged beneath a mud flow. See the box, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, above. Not for another 1,700 years were systematic excavations begun on the buried towns. Through examination of their preserved remains, archaeologists have been able to reconstruct the everyday life and art of these Roman towns. Their discovery in the 18th century was an important force in stimulating both scholarly and public interest in classical antiquity and helped give rise to the neoclassical style of that century. Crisis in the late Empire. Focus questions: what reforms did Diocletian and Constantine institute, and to what extent were the reforms successful? What role did the Germanic tribes play in the late Roman Empire? During the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good emperors, a number of natural catastrophes struck Rome. To many Romans, these natural disasters seemed to portend an ominous future for Rome. New problems arose soon after the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180. Crises in the 3rd century. In the course of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire came near to collapse. Military monarchy under the Severan rulers, 193 to 235, which restored order after a series of civil wars, was followed by military anarchy. For the next 50 years, 235 to 284, the empire was mired in the chaos of continual civil war. Contenders for the imperial throne found that bribing soldiers was an effective way to become emperor. In these 5 decades, there were 27 emperors, only 4 of whom did not meet a violent end. At the same time, the empire was beset by a series of invasions, no doubt exacerbated by the civil wars. In the east, the Sassanid Persians made inroads into Roman territory. Germanic tribes also poured into the empire. Not until the end of the 3rd century were most of the boundaries restored. Invasions, civil wars, and plague came close to causing an economic collapse of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. There was a noticeable decline in trade and small industry, and the labor shortage caused by the plague affected both military recruiting and the economy. Farm production deteriorated significantly as fields were ravaged by invaders or, even more often, by the defending Roman armies. The monetary system began to collapse as a result of debased coinage and inflation. Armies were needed more than ever, but financial strains made it difficult to pay and enlist more soldiers. By the mid-3rd century, the state had to hire Germans to fight under Roman commanders. The late Roman Empire. At the end of the 3rd and beginning of the 4th centuries, the Roman Empire gained a new lease on life through the efforts of two strong emperors, Diocletian and Constantine. Under their rule, the empire was transformed into a new state, the so-called Late Empire, distinguished by a new governmental structure, a rigid economic and social system, and a new state religion, Christianity. See, transformation of the Roman world. The development of Christianity, later in this chapter. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine. Both Diocletian, 284–305, and Constantine, 306–337, extended imperial control by strengthening and expanding the administrative bureaucracies of the Roman Empire. A hierarchy of officials exercised control at the various levels of government. The army was enlarged, and mobile units were set up that could be quickly moved to support frontier troops when the borders were threatened. Constantine's biggest project was the construction of a new capital city in the east, on the site of the Greek city of Byzantium on the shores of the Bosphorus. Eventually renamed Constantinople, modern Istanbul, the city was developed for defensive reasons and had an excellent strategic location. Calling it his New Rome, Constantine endowed the city with a forum, large palaces, and a vast amphitheater. The political and military reforms of Diocletian and Constantine also greatly increased two institutions, the army and the civil service, that drained most of the public funds. Though more revenues were needed to pay for the army and the bureaucracy, the population was not growing, so the tax base could not be expanded. To ensure the tax base and keep the empire going despite the shortage of labor, the emperors issued edicts that forced people to remain in their designated vocations. Basic jobs, such as baker or shipper, became hereditary. The fortunes of free tenant farmers also declined. Soon they found themselves bound to the land by large landowners who took advantage of depressed agricultural conditions to enlarge their landed estates. In general, the economic and social policies of Diocletian and Constantine were based on an unprecedented degree of control and coercion. Though temporarily successful, such authoritarian policies in the long run stifled the very vitality the late empire needed to revive its sagging fortunes. The end of the Western Empire. Constantine had reunited the Roman Empire and restored a semblance of order.
After his death, however, the empire continued to divide into western and eastern parts, which had become two virtually independent states by 395. In the course of the 5th century, while the empire in the east remained intact under the Roman emperor in Constantinople, the administrative structure of the empire in the west collapsed and was replaced by an assortment of Germanic kingdoms. The process was a gradual one, beginning with the movement of Germans into the empire. Although the Romans had established a series of political frontiers along the Rhine and Danube rivers, Romans and Germans often came into contact across these boundaries, absorbing these people without harm to its political structure. In the late 4th century, however, the Germanic tribes came under new pressure when the Huns, a fierce tribe of nomads from the steppes of Asia who may have been related to the Xiongnu, the invaders of the Han Empire in China, moved into the Black Sea region, possibly attracted by the riches of the empire to its south. One of the groups displaced by the Huns was the Visigoths, who moved south and west, crossed the Danube into Roman territory, and settled down as Roman allies. But the Visigoths soon revolted, and the Roman attempt to stop them at Adrianople in 378 led to a crushing defeat for Rome. Increasing numbers of Germans now crossed the frontiers. In 410, the Visigoths sacked Rome. Vandals poured into southern Spain and Africa, Visigoths into Spain and Gaul. The Vandals crossed into Italy from North Africa and ravaged Rome again in 455. By the middle of the 5th century,
the western provinces of the Roman Empire had been taken over by Germanic peoples who set up their own independent kingdoms. At the same time, a semblance of imperial authority remained in Rome, although the real power behind the throne tended to rest in the hands of important military officials known as masters of the soldiers. These military commanders controlled the government and dominated the imperial court. In 476, Odoacer, a new master of the soldiers, himself of German origin, deposed the Roman emperor, the boy Romulus Augustulus. To many historians, the deposition of Romulus signaled the end of the Roman Empire in the West. Of course, this is only a symbolic date, as much of direct imperial rule had already been lost in the course of the 5th century. What caused the fall of the Western Roman Empire? The end of the Roman Empire in the West has given rise to numerous theories that attempt to provide a single, all-encompassing reason for the decline and fall of the Roman Empire.
These include the following. Christianity's emphasis on a spiritual kingdom undermined Roman military virtues and patriotism. Traditional Roman values declined as non-Italians gained prominence in the empire. Lead poisoning caused by water pipes and cups made of lead resulted in a mental decline. Plague decimated the population. Rome failed to advance technologically because of slavery, and Rome was unable to achieve a workable political system.
There may be an element of truth in each of these theories, but all of them have also been challenged. History is an intricate web of relationships, causes, and effects. No single explanation will ever suffice to explain historical events. One thing is clear, however. Weakened by a shortage of manpower, the Roman army in the West was simply not able to fend off the hordes of people invading Italy and Gaul. In contrast, the Eastern Roman Empire, which would survive for another 1,000 years, remained largely free from invasion. Transformation of the Roman world, the development of Christianity. Focus question: what characteristics of Christianity enabled it to grow and ultimately to triumph as the official religion of the Roman Empire? The rise of Christianity marked a fundamental break with the dominant values of the Greco-Roman world.
To understand the rise of Christianity, we must first examine both the religious environment of the Roman world and the Jewish background from which Christianity emerged.
The religious world of the Roman Empire.
The Roman state religion focused on the worship of a pantheon of Greco-Roman gods and goddesses, including Juno, the patron goddess of women, Minerva, the goddess of craftspeople, Mars, the god of war, and Jupiter Optimus Maximus, best and greatest, who became the patron deity of Rome and assumed a central place in the religious life of the city. The Romans believed that the observance of proper ritual by state priests brought them into a right relationship with the gods, thereby guaranteeing security, peace, and prosperity, and that their success in creating an empire confirmed that they enjoyed the favor of the gods. As the 1st century BCE, politician Cicero claimed, "We have overcome all the nations of the world because we have realized that the world is directed and governed by the gods." The polytheistic Romans were extremely tolerant of other religions. They allowed the worship of native gods and goddesses throughout their provinces and even adopted some of the local deities. In addition, beginning with Augustus, emperors were often officially made gods by the Roman Senate, thus bolstering support for the emperors. The desire for a more emotional spiritual experience led many people to the mystery religions of the Hellenistic East, which flooded into the Western Roman world during the early empire. The mystery religions offered their followers entry into a higher world of reality and the promise of a future life superior to the present one. The Jewish background. In addition to the mystery religions, the Romans' expansion into the Eastern Mediterranean also brought them into contact with the Jews. Roman involvement with the Jews began in 63 BCE, and by 6 CE, Judea, which embraced the old Jewish kingdom of Judah, had been made a province and placed under the direction of a Roman procurator.
But unrest continued, augmented by divisions among the Jews themselves. One group, the Essenes, awaited a Messiah who would save Israel from oppression, usher in the kingdom of God, and establish paradise on earth. Another group, the Zealots, were militant extremists who advocated the violent overthrow of Roman rule. A Jewish revolt in 66 CE was crushed by the Romans 4 years later. The Jewish temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, and Roman power once more stood supreme in Judea. The rise of Christianity. Jesus of Nazareth, c. 6 BCE to c. 29 CE, was a Palestinian Jew who grew up in Galilee, an important center of the militant Zealots. Jesus' message was simple. He reassured his fellow Jews that he did not plan to undermine their traditional religion. What was important was not strict adherence to the letter of the law but the transformation of the inner person. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. God's command was simply to love God and one another. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. In his teachings, Jesus presented the ethical concepts, humility, charity, and brotherly love, that would form the basis of the value system of medieval Western civilization. To the Roman authorities of Palestine, however, Jesus was a potential revolutionary who might transform Jewish expectations of a messianic kingdom into a revolt against Rome. Therefore, Jesus found himself denounced on many sides, and the procurator Pontius Pilate ordered his crucifixion. But that did not solve the problem. A few loyal followers of Jesus spread the story that Jesus had overcome death, had been resurrected, and had then ascended into heaven. The belief in Jesus' resurrection became an important tenet of Christian doctrine. Jesus was now hailed as the Anointed One, Christus in Greek, the Messiah who would return and usher in the kingdom of God on earth. Christianity began, then, as a religious movement within Judaism and was viewed that way by Roman authorities for many decades. One of the prominent figures in early Christianity, however, Paul of Tarsus, c. 5 to c. 67, believed that the message of Jesus should be preached not only to Jews but to Gentiles, non-Jews, as well. Paul taught that Jesus was the Savior, the Son of God, who had come to earth to save all humans, who were all sinners as a result of Adam's sin of disobedience against God. By his death, Jesus had atoned for the sins of all humans and made possible their reconciliation with God and hence their salvation. By accepting Jesus as their Savior, they too could be saved. The spread of Christianity. Christianity spread slowly at first.
Although the teachings of early Christianity were mostly disseminated by preaching, written materials also appeared. Among them were a series of epistles, letters written by Paul outlining Christian beliefs for different Christian communities. Some of Jesus' disciples may also have preserved some of the sayings of the Master in writing and would have passed on personal memories that became the basis of the written Gospels, the good news concerning Jesus, of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which by the end of the 1st century CE had become the authoritative record of Jesus' life and teachings and formed the core of the New Testament. Recently, some scholars have argued that other Gospels, such as that of Thomas, were rejected because they deviated from the beliefs about Jesus held by the emerging church leaders.
Although Jerusalem was the first center of Christianity, its destruction by the Romans in 70 CE dispersed the Christians and left individual Christian churches with considerable independence. By 100, Christian churches had been established in most of the major cities of the East and in some places in the western part of the empire. Many early Christians came from the ranks of Hellenized Jews and the Greek-speaking populations of the East.
But in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, an increasing number of followers came from Latin-speaking peoples. Initially, the Romans did not pay much attention to the Christians, whom they regarded as simply another Jewish sect. As time passed, however, the Roman attitude toward Christianity began to change. The Romans tolerated other religions as long as they did not threaten public order or public morals.
Many Romans came to view Christians as harmful to the Roman state because they refused to worship the state gods and emperors. Nevertheless, Roman persecution of Christians in the 1st and 2nd centuries was only sporadic and local, never systematic. In the 2nd century, Christians were largely ignored as harmless. By the end of the reigns of the 5 good emperors, Christians still represented a small minority within the empire, but one of considerable strength. The triumph of Christianity. Christianity grew slowly in the 1st century, took root in the 2nd, and by the 3rd had spread widely. Why was the new faith able to attract so many followers? First, the Christian message had much to offer the Roman world. The promise of salvation, made possible by Jesus' death and resurrection, made a resounding impact on a world full of suffering and injustice. Christianity seemed to imbue life with a meaning and purpose beyond the simple material things of everyday reality. Second, Christianity seemed familiar. It was regarded as simply another mystery religion, offering immortality as the result of the sacrificial death of a Savior God. At the same time, it offered more than the other mystery religions did. Jesus had been a human figure, not a mythological one, and people could relate to him. Finally, Christianity fulfilled the human need to belong. Christians formed communities bound to one another in which people could express their love by helping each other and offering assistance to the poor, sick, widowed, and orphaned. Christianity satisfied the need to belong in a way that the huge, impersonal, and remote Roman Empire never could. Christianity proved attractive to all classes. The promise of eternal life was for all, rich, poor, aristocrats, slaves, men, and women. Christianity emphasized a sense of spiritual equality for all people. Many women, in fact, found that Christianity offered them new roles and new forms of companionship with other women. Christian women fostered the new religion in their homes and preached their convictions to other people in their towns and villages. Many also died for their faith. Perpetua was an aristocratic woman who converted to Christianity. Her pagan family begged her to renounce her new faith, but she refused.
Arrested by the Roman authorities, she chose instead to die for her faith and was one of a group of Christians who were slaughtered by wild beasts in the arena at Carthage on March 7, 203. Moreover, the sporadic persecution of Christians by the Romans in the 1st and 2nd centuries not only did little to stop the growth of Christianity, but in fact served to strengthen it as an institution in the 2nd and 3rd centuries by causing it to become more organized.
Crucial to this change was the emerging role of the bishops, who began to assume more control over church communities. The Christian church was creating a well-defined hierarchical structure in which the bishops and clergy were salaried officers separate from the laity or regular church members. As the Christian church became more organized, some emperors in the 3rd century responded with more systematic persecutions, but their schemes failed. The last great persecution was at the beginning of the 4th century, but by that time, Christianity had become too strong to be eradicated by force. After Constantine became the first Christian emperor, Christianity flourished. Although Constantine was not baptized until the end of his life, in 313 he issued the Edict of Milan officially tolerating Christianity. Under Theodosius the Great, 378 to 395, it was made the official religion of the Roman Empire. In less than 4 centuries, Christianity had triumphed. A comparison of the Roman and Han Empire. Focus question: in what ways were the Roman Empire and the Han Chinese Empire similar, and in what ways were they different? At the beginning of the first millennium CE, two great empires, the Roman Empire in the west and the Han Empire in the east, dominated large areas of the world. Although there was little contact between them, the two empires exhibited some remarkable similarities. Both lasted for centuries, and both were extremely successful in establishing centralized control. Both built elaborate systems of roads in order to rule efficiently and relied on provincial officials, and especially on towns and cities, for local administration. Architectural features found in the capital cities of Rome and Chang'an were also transferred on a smaller scale to provincial towns and cities. In both empires, settled conditions led to a high level of agricultural production that sustained large populations, estimated at between 50 and 60 million in each empire. Although both empires expanded into areas with different languages, ethnic groups, and ways of life, they managed to extend their legal and political institutions, their technical skills, and their languages throughout their empire. In this way, they integrated local communities into a common political and cultural framework. The Roman and Han Empire also had similar social and economic structures. The family stood at the heart of the social structure, and the male head of the family was all-powerful. The family also inculcated the values that helped make the empire strong: duty, courage, obedience, and discipline. The wealth of both societies also depended on agriculture. Although a free peasantry provided a backbone of strength and stability in each empire, wealthy landowners were able to gradually convert the free peasants into tenant farmers and thereby ultimately to undermine the power of the imperial governments. Of course, there were also significant differences. The empire came into existence in different ways. Han China inherited an ideal of imperial culture on which to build. The Romans, on the other hand, began with a small city-state ruled collectively by its prominent citizens. As the Romans expanded throughout Italy and the Mediterranean, they eventually created a single imperial state. There were also economic and social differences. Merchants were more highly regarded and allowed more freedom in Rome than they were in China. One key reason for this difference is that whereas many inhabitants of the Roman Empire depended to a considerable degree on commerce to obtain such staples as wheat, olives, wine, cloth, and timber, the vast majority of Chinese were subsistence farmers whose needs, when they were supplied, could normally be met by the local environment. As a result, there was undoubtedly less social mobility in China than in Rome, and many Chinese peasants spent their entire lives without venturing far beyond the village gate. Another difference is that over the 400 years of the empire existence, Chinese imperial authority was far more stable. With a more cohesive territory and a strong dynastic tradition, Chinese rulers could easily pass on their authority to other family members. In contrast, in the Roman Empire, political instability was a chronic problem, at least in some periods. Although Roman emperors were accorded divine status by the Roman Senate after death, accession to the Roman imperial throne depended less on solid dynastic principles and more on pure military force. Despite the differences, one major inescapable similarity remains. Both empires eventually faced overwhelming problems. Both suffered from over-expansion, and both fortified their long borders with walls, forts, and military garrisons to guard against invasions of nomadic people. Both empires were periodically beset by invasions of nomadic peoples. The Han dynasty was weakened by the incursions of the Xiongnu, and the Western Roman Empire eventually collapsed in the face of incursions by the Germanic peoples. Nevertheless, one inescapable difference between these two contemporary empires also remains. Although the Han dynasty collapsed, the Chinese imperial tradition, along with the class structure and set of values that sustained that tradition, survived, and the Chinese empire, under new dynasties, continued well into the 20th century as a single political entity. In stark contrast, the Roman Empire in the West collapsed and lived on only as an idea. Chronology. The Roman conquest of Italy and the Mediterranean. Conquest of Latins completed. 340 BCE. Creation of the Roman Confederation. 338 BCE. First Punic War. 264 to 241 BCE. Second Punic War. 218 to 201 BCE. Battle of Cannae. 216 BCE. Roman seizure of Spain. 206 BCE. Battle of Zama. 202 BCE. Third Punic War. 149 to 146 BCE. Macedonia made a Roman province. 148 BCE. Destruction of Carthage. 146 BCE. Kingdom of Pergamum to Rome. 133 BCE. Opposing viewpoints. Women in the Roman and Har Empire. Family and society. The two excerpts below are taken from the works of writers in two of the ancient world's great empire. One is a male philosopher living in the Roman Empire and the other is a female writer in Ha China. Although they reflect different cultures, they have similar ideas about the role and education of women. Gaius Musonius Rufus was a philosopher who taught Stoicism in Rome in the 1st century CE. His students wrote down some of his philosophical opinions. The excerpt here is taken from his thoughts on whether women should study philosophy. Ban Zhao was a well-educated woman from a prominent aristocratic family. She wrote admonitions for women as a guide for upper-class women in the proper performance of their wifely duties. Gaius Musonius Rufus, that women too should study philosophy.
When he was asked whether women ought to study philosophy, he began to answer, "Women have received from the gods the same ability to reason that men have. Likewise, women have the same senses as men, sight, hearing, smell, and the rest. Since that is so, why is it appropriate for men to seek out and examine how they might live well, that is, to practice philosophy, but not women?"
Let us consider in detail the qualities that a woman who seeks to be good must possess, for it will be apparent that she could acquire each of these qualities from the practice of philosophy.
In the first place, a woman must run her household and pick out what is beneficial for her home and take charge of the household slaves. Next, a woman must be chaste, and capable of keeping herself free from illegal love affairs, and not enjoy quarrels, not be extravagant or occupied with her appearance. There are still other requirements. She must control anger, and not be overcome by grief, and be stronger than every kind of emotion. When asked if sons and daughters should be given the same education,
he replied, "There are not different sets of virtues for men and women. First, men and women both need to be sensible. Second, both need to live just lives. Third, a wife ought to be chaste, and so should a husband." Well, then, suppose someone says, "Do you think that men ought to learn spinning like women and that women ought to practice gymnastics like men?" No, that is not what I suggest. I say that because in the case of the human race, the males are naturally stronger, and the women weaker. Appropriate work ought to be assigned to each, and the heavier task be given to the stronger, and the lighter to the weaker. For this reason, spinning is more appropriate work for women than for men, and household management. Gymnastics are more appropriate for men than for women, and outdoor work likewise. Some tasks are more appropriate for one nature, others for the other. For that reason some jobs are called men's work, and others women's. Without philosophy no man and no woman either can be well educated. I do not mean to say that women need to have clarity with or facility in argument, because they will use philosophy as women use it. My point is that women ought to be good and noble in their characters, and that philosophy is no other than the training for that nobility. Ban Zhao, Admonitions for Women. Let a woman modestly yield to others. Let her respect others, let her put others first, herself last. Should she do something good, let her not mention it, Should she do something bad, let her not deny it. Let her bear contempt. Let her even endure when others speak or do evil to her. Let a woman retire late to bed, but rise early to her duties. Let her not dread tasks by day or night. Let her not refuse to perform domestic duties whether easy or difficult. That which must be done, let her finish completely, tidily and systematically. Let a woman be composed in demeanor and upright in bearing in the service of her husband. Let her live in purity and quietness and keep watch over herself. Let her not love gossip and silly laughter. Let her cleanse, purify and arrange in order the wine and the food for the offerings to the ancestors. Now examine the gentlemen of the present age. They only know that wives must be controlled and that the husband's authority must be maintained. They therefore teach their boys to read books and study histories, yet only to teach men and not to teach women. Is this not ignoring the reciprocal relation between them? Book learning begins at the age of 8, and at the age of 15 one goes off to school. Why, however, should this principle not apply to girls as well as boys? In womanly behavior there are 4 things: womanly virtue, womanly speech, womanly appearance, and womanly work. To guard carefully her chastity, to control circumspectly her behavior, in every motion to exhibit modesty, this may be called womanly virtue. To choose her words with care, to avoid vulgar language, to speak at appropriate times, and not to be offensive to others may be called womanly speech. To wash and scrub dirt and grime, to keep clothes and ornaments fresh and clean, to wash the head and bathe the body regularly, may be called womanly appearance. With wholehearted devotion to sew and weave, not to love gossip and silly laughter, to prepare the wine and food for serving guests may be called womanly work. What are the views of Gaius Musonius Rufus and Ban Zhao on the responsibilities of a woman? In what ways do they agree? In what ways do they disagree? How do you explain the differences? From your point of view, what are the strengths and weaknesses in each argument? Cincinnatus saves Rome, a Roman morality tale. There is perhaps no better account of how the virtues of duty and simplicity enabled good Roman citizens to prevail during the travails of the 5th century BCE than Livy's account of Cincinnatus. He was chosen dictator, supposedly in 457 BCE, to defend Rome against the attacks of the Eque. The position of dictator was a temporary expedient used only in emergencies. The consuls would resign, and a leader with unlimited power would be appointed for a specified period, usually 6 months. In this account, Cincinnatus did his duty, defeated the Eque, and returned to his simple farm in just 15 days. Livy, the early history of Rome. The city was thrown into a state of turmoil, and the general alarm was as great as if Rome herself was surrounded. Nausius was sent for, but it was quickly decided that he was not the man to inspire full confidence. The situation evidently called for a dictator, and, with no dissentient voice, Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus was named for the post.
Now I would solicit the particular attention of those numerous people who imagine that money is everything in this world, and that rank and ability are inseparable from wealth. Let them observe that Cincinnatus, the one man in whom Rome reposed all her hope of survival, was at that moment working a little 3-acre farm, west of the Tiber, just opposite the spot where the shipyards are today. A mission from the city found him at work on his land, digging a ditch, maybe, or plowing. Greetings were exchanged, and he was asked, with a prayer for divine blessing on himself and his country, to put on his toga and hear the Senate's instructions. This naturally surprised him, and, asking if all were well, he told his wife Rasilia to run to their cottage and fetch his toga. The toga was brought, and wiping the grimy sweat from his hands and face he put it on. At once the envoys from the city saluted him, with congratulations, as dictator, invited him to enter Rome, and informed him of the terrible danger of Municius's army.
A state vessel was waiting for him on the river, and on the city bank he was welcomed by his 3 sons who had come to meet him, then by other kinsmen and friends, and finally by nearly the whole body of senators.
Closely attended by all these people and preceded by his lictors, he was then escorted to his residence through streets lined with great crowds of common folk who, be it said, were by no means so pleased to see the new dictator, as they thought his power excessive and dreaded the way in which he was likely to use it. Cincinnatus proceeds to raise an army, march out, and defeat the Equi. In Rome the Senate was convened by Quintus Fabius the city prefect, and a decree was passed inviting Cincinnatus to enter in triumph with his troops.
The chariot he rode in was preceded by the enemy commanders in the military standards, and followed by his army loaded with its spoils. Cincinnatus finally resigned after holding office for 15 days, having originally accepted it for a period of 6 months. What values did Livy emphasize in his account of Cincinnatus? How important were those values to Rome's success? Why did Livy say he wrote his history? Comparative illustration. Interaction and exchange. Roman and Chinese roads. The Romans constructed a remarkable system of roads. After laying a foundation of gravel, which allowed for drainage, the Roman builders topped it with flagstones, closely fitted together. Unlike other peoples who built similar kinds of roads, the Romans did not follow the contours of the land but made their roads as straight as possible to facilitate communications and transportation, especially for military purposes. Seen here, above, is a view of the Via Appia, Appian Way, built in 312 BCE. To make it easy for Roman armies to march from Rome to the newly conquered city of Capua, a distance of 152 miles, shown on the map. By the beginning of the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire contained 372 major roads covering 50,000 miles. Like the Roman Empire, the Haar Empire relied on roads constructed with stone slabs for the movement of military forces, right? The first emperor of Qin was responsible for the construction of 4,350 miles of roads, and by the end of the 2nd century CE, China had almost 22,000 miles of roads. Although roads in both the Roman and Chinese Empire were originally constructed for military purposes, they came to be used for communications and commercial traffic as well. However, unlike the Romans, the Haar emperors used waterways for most of their transportation needs. What was the importance of roads to the Roman and Haar Empire? The destruction of Carthage. The Romans used a technical breach of Carthage's peace treaty with Rome to undertake a third and final war with Carthage, 149 to 146 BCE. Although Carthage posed no real threat to Rome's security, the Romans still remembered the traumatic experiences of the Second Punic War, when Hannibal had ravaged much of their homeland. The city was razed, the survivors sold into slavery, and the land turned into a province. In this passage, the historian Appian of Alexandria describes the final destruction of Carthage by the Romans under the command of Scipio Aemilianus. Appian, Roman History. Then came new scenes of horror. The fire spread and carried everything down, and the soldiers did not wait to destroy the buildings little by little, but pulled them all down together. So the crashing grew louder, and many fell with the stones into the midst dead. Others were seen still living, especially old men, women, and young children who had hidden in the inmost nooks of the houses, some of them wounded, some more or less burned, and uttering horrible cries. Still others, thrust out and falling from such a height with the stones, timbers, and fire, were torn asunder into all kinds of horrible shapes, crushed and mangled.
Nor was this the end of their miseries, for the street cleaner, who were removing the rubbish with axes, mattocks, and boat hooks, and making the roads passable, tossed with these instruments the dead and the living together into holes in the ground, sweeping them along like sticks and stones or turning them over with their iron tools, and man was used for filling up a ditch. Some were thrown in head foremost, while their legs,
sticking out of the ground, writhed a long time. Others fell with their feet downward and their heads above ground. Horses ran over them, crushing their faces and skulls, not purposely on the part of the riders, but in their headlong haste.
Nor did the street cleaner either do these things on purpose. But the press of war, the glory of approaching victory, the rush of the soldiery, the confused noise of heralds and trumpeters all round, the tribunes and centurions changing guard and marching the cohorts hither and thither, altogether made everybody frantic and heedless of the spectacle before their eyes. 6 days and nights were consumed in this kind of turmoil, the soldiers being changed so that they might not be worn out with toil, slaughter, want of sleep, and these horrid sights. Scipio, beholding this city, which had flourished 700 years from its foundation and had ruled over so many lands, islands, and seas, as rich in arms and fleets, elephants, and money as the mightiest empire, but far surpassing them in hardihood and high spirit, now come to its end in total destruction. Scipio, beholding this spectacle,
is said to have shed tears and publicly lamented the fortune of the enemy.
After meditating by himself a long time and reflecting on the inevitable fall of cities, nations, and empire, as well as of individuals, upon the fate of Troy, that once proud city, upon the fate of the Assyrian, the Median, and afterwards of the great Persian Empire, and, most recently of all, of the splendid empire of Macedon, either voluntarily or otherwise, the words of the poet Homer, Iliad, escaped his lips, the day shall come in which our sacred Troyan Priene, and the people over whom spear-bearing Priene rules,
shall perish all. Being asked by Polybius in familiar conversation, for Polybius had been his tutor, what he meant by using these words, Polybius says that he did not hesitate frankly to name his own country, for whose fate he feared when he considered the mutability of human affairs. And Polybius wrote this down just as he heard it. What does the description of Rome's destruction of Carthage reveal about the nature of Roman imperialism? What features seem more rhetorical than realistic? Why? The assassination of Julius Caesar. Politics and government. When it became apparent that Julius Caesar had no intention of restoring the republic as they conceived it, about 60 senators, many of them his friends or pardoned enemies, formed a conspiracy to assassinate the dictator. Gaius Cassius and Marcus Brutus, who led the plot, naively imagined that this act would restore the traditional republic. The conspirators set the Ides of March 15th, of 44 BCE, as the date for the assassination. Caesar was in the midst of preparations for a campaign in the eastern part of the empire. Although warned about a plot against his life, he chose to disregard it. This account of Caesar's death is taken from his biography by the Greek writer Plutarch. Plutarch, Life of Caesar. Fate, however, is to all appearance more unavoidable than unexpected. For many strange prodigies and apparitions are said to have been observed shortly before this event. One finds it also related by many that a soothsayer bade him, Caesar, prepare for some great danger on the Ides of March. When this day was come, Caesar, as he went to the Senate, met this soothsayer, and said to him mockingly, The Ides of March are come. Who answered him calmly, Yes, they are come, but they are not past. All these things might happen by chance.
But the place which was destined for the scene of this murder, in which the Senate met that day, was the same in which Pompey's statue stood, and was one of the edifices which Pompey had raised and dedicated with his theatre to the use of the public, plainly showing that there was something of a supernatural influence which guided the action and ordered it to that particular place. Cassius, just before the act, is said to have looked toward Pompey's statue, and silently implored his assistance. When Caesar entered, the Senate stood up to show their respect to him, and of Brutus's confederates, some came about his chair and stood behind it. Others met him, pretending to add their petitions to those of Tullius Cimber, in behalf of his brother, who was in exile, and they followed him with their joint applications till he came to his seat.
When he sat down, he refused to comply with their requests, and upon their urging him further began to reproach them severely for their demand. When Tilius, laying hold of his robe with both his hands, pulled it down from his neck, which was the signal for the assault. Cas gave him the first cut in the neck, which was not mortal nor dangerous, as coming from one who at the beginning of such a bold action was probably very much disturbed. Caesar immediately turned about, and laid his hand upon the dagger and kept hold of it. And both of them at the same time cried out, "He that received the blow," in Latin, while Cas, "What does this mean?" And he that gave it, in Greek, to his brother, "Brother, help." Upon this first onset, those who were not privy to the design were astonished, and their horror and amazement at what they saw was so great that they dared not fly nor assist Caesar, nor so much as speak a word. But those who came prepared for the business enclosed him on every side, with their naked daggers in their hands. Which way soever he turned he met with blows, and saw their swords levelled at his face and eyes, and was encompassed like a wild beast in the toils on every side. For it had been agreed they should each of them make a thrust at him, and flesh themselves with his blood, for which reason Brutus also gave him one stab in the groin.
Some say that he fought and resisted all the rest, shifting his body to avoid the blows, and calling out for help, but that when he saw Brutus's sword drawn, he covered his face with his robe and submitted, letting himself fall, whether it were by chance or that he was pushed in that direction by his murderers, at the foot of the pedestal on which Pompey's statue stood, and which was thus wetted with his blood.
So that Pompey himself seemed to have presided, as it were, over the revenge done upon his adversary, who lay here at his feet, and breathed out his soul through his multitude of wounds, for they say he received 23. And the conspirators themselves were many of them wounded by each other while they all levelled their blows at the same person. What does this account of Caesar's assassination reveal about the character of Julius Caesar? Based on this selection, what lessons did classical historians intend their readers to take from their accounts of great and dramatic political events? The achievements of Augustus. This excerpt is taken from a text written by Augustus and inscribed on a bronze tablet at Rome. Copies of the text in stone were displayed in many provincial capitals. Called the most famous ancient inscription, the Res Gestae of Augustus summarizes his accomplishments in three major areas: his officers, his private expenditures on behalf of the state, and his exploits in war and peace. Though factual in approach, it is a highly subjective account. Augustus, Res Gestae. Below is a copy of the accomplishments of the deified Augustus, by which he brought the whole world under the empire of the Roman people, and of the monies expended by him on the state and the Roman people, as inscribed on two bronze pillars set up in Rome.
1. At the age of 19, on my own initiative and at my own expense, I raised an army by means of which I liberated the Republic, which was oppressed by the tyranny of a faction, Mark Antony and his supporters. 2. Those who assassinated my father Julius Caesar, his adoptive father, I drove into exile, avenging their crime by due process of law. And afterwards, when they waged war against the state, I conquered them twice on the battlefield. 3. I waged many wars throughout the whole world by land and by sea, both civil and foreign, and when victorious I spared all citizens who sought pardon. 5. The dictatorship offered to me, by the people and the Senate, both in my absence and in my presence, I refused to accept. 17. 4 times I came to the assistance of the treasury with my own money, transferring to those in charge of the treasury 150 million sesterces. And in the consulship of Marcus Lepidus and Lucius Arruntius, one transferred out of my own patrimony 170 million sesterces to the soldiers' bonus fund, which was established on my advice for the purpose of providing bonuses for soldiers who had completed 20 or more years of service. 22. I gave a gladiatorial show 3 times in my own name, and 5 times in the names of my sons or grandsons. At these shows about 10,000 fought. 25. I brought peace to the sea by suppressing the pirates. In that war, one turned over to their masters for punishment nearly 30,000 slaves who had run away from their owners and taken up arms against the state. 26. I extended the frontiers of all the provinces of the Roman people on whose boundaries were peoples not subject to our empire. 27. I added Egypt to the empire of the Roman people. 35. When I held my 13th consulship, the Senate, the equestrian order, and the entire Roman people gave me the title of Father of the country, and decreed that this title should be inscribed in the vestibule of my house,
in the Julian Senate House, and in the Augustan Forum. At the time I wrote this document I was in my 76th year. What were the achievements of Augustus? To what extent did these accomplishments create the job of being emperor? In what sense could this document be called a piece of propaganda? The Roman fear of slaves. Family and society. The lowest stratum of the Roman population consisted of slaves. They were used extensively in households, at the court, as artisans in industrial enterprises, as business managers, and in numerous other ways. Although some historians have argued that slaves were treated more humanely during the early empire, these selections by the Roman historian Tacitus and the Roman statesman Pliny indicate that slaves still rebelled against their masters because of mistreatment.
Many masters continued to live in fear of their slaves, as witnessed by the saying, "As many enemies as you have slaves."
Tacitus, The Annals of Imperial Rome. Soon afterwards the city prefect, Lucius Pedanius Secundus, was murdered by one of his slaves, in 61 CE. Either Pedanius had refused to free the murderer after agreeing to a price, or the slave, in a homosexual infatuation, found competition from his master intolerable. After the murder, ancient custom required that every slave residing under the same roof must be executed. But a crowd gathered, eager to save so many innocent lives, and rioting began. The Senate House was besieged. Inside, there was feeling against excessive severity, but the majority opposed any change. Among the latter was Gaius Cassius Longinus, who when his turn came spoke as follows: "An ex-consul has been deliberately murdered by a slave in his own home. None of his fellow slaves prevented or betrayed the murderer, though the senatorial decree threatening the whole household with execution still stands. Exempt them from the penalty if you like. But then, if the city prefect was not important enough to be immune, who will be? Who will have enough slaves to protect him if Pedanius's 400 were too few? Who can rely on his household's help if even fear for their own lives does not make them shield us?" The sentence of death was carried out. Pliny the Younger to Acilius. A shocking affair, worthy of more publicity than a letter can bestow, has befallen Lasius Macedo, a man of Praetorian rank, at the hands of his own slaves. He was known to be an overbearing and cruel master, and one who forgot, or rather remembered too keenly, that his own father had been a slave. He was bathing at his villa near Formiae, when he was suddenly surrounded by his slaves. One seized him by the throat, another struck him on the forehead, and others smote him in the chest. When they thought the breath had left his body, they flung him onto the hot tiled floor to see if he was still alive. Whether he was insensible, or merely pretended to be so, he certainly did not move, and lying there at full length, he made them think that he was actually dead. At length they carried him out, as though he had been overcome by the heat, and handed him over to his trustier servants, while his women ran shrieking and wailing to his side. Aroused by their cries and restored by the coolness of the room where he lay, he opened his eyes and moved his limbs, betraying thereby that he was still alive, as it was then safe to do so. His slaves took to flight. Most of them have been captured, but some are still being hunted for. Thanks to the attentions he received, Macedo was kept alive for a few days and had the satisfaction of full vengeance before he died, for he exacted the same punishment while he still lived as is usually taken when the victim of a murder dies. You see the dangers, the affronts and insults we are exposed to, and no one can feel at all secure because he is an easy and mild-tempered master. What do these texts reveal about the practice of slavery in the Roman Empire? What were Roman attitudes toward the events discussed in these documents? Film and history. Gladiator, 2000. The film Gladiator, directed by Ridley Scott, is a fictional story set in the Roman Empire near the end of the 2nd century CE. In the movie, Emperor Marcus Aurelius, Richard Harris, informs his son Commodus, Joaquin Phoenix, that he intends to turn over imperial power to his successful and respected general, Maximus, Russell Crowe, in the hope that this decent and honest man can restore the Roman Senate and revive the Republic. Commodus reacts by killing his father, assuming the position of emperor, and ordering the deaths of Maximus, his wife, and son. Maximus escapes but returns too late to Spain to save his wife and child. He is captured and then sold into slavery to Proximo, Oliver Reed, who trains him to be a gladiator. Maximus is eventually sent to Rome, where he becomes a superhero in the gladiatorial games in the Roman Colosseum, all the while awaiting an opportunity to avenge the death of his wife and son by killing Commodus. Maximus becomes involved in a plot with Lucilla, Connie Nielsen, the emperor's sister, and Gracchus, Derek Jacobi, a Roman senator, to rejoin his army, march on Rome, and overthrow the emperor. When Commodus discovers the plot, he challenges the captured Maximus to a duel in the Colosseum but stabs him first to ensure his own success. Despite his injury, Maximus kills the emperor in combat. Gladiator is a relatively exciting story, but how much of it is based on historical facts? With the exception of Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, and Lucilla, all of the characters are fictional. Marcus Aurelius was a kind emperor with a love of philosophy and died in 180, probably from plague, and certainly not by his son's hands, as depicted in the film. Commodus ruled from 180 to 192, although he was only 18 when he became emperor, not in his late 20s as in the movie, and he had blonde hair, not dark hair. Commodus was an unstable and cruel young man who was strongly attracted to gladiatorial contests. He was obsessed with performing in the arena, especially with slaughtering animals. He was not killed in the Colosseum, however, but strangled by his wrestling partner on the last day of 192. Contrary to the movie, Marcus Aurelius had no intention of restoring the Republic. By 180, most Romans had become well accustomed to the empire. In fact, Marcus Aurelius had already made his son Commodus a joint ruler in 177. Nor had Marcus Aurelius banned gladiatorial games, as the movie claims. And although Commodus's sister Lucilla did enter into a plot with some senators to assassinate her brother, the plot of 182 failed, and the conspirators, including Lucilla, were executed. Although Gladiator shows little concern for historical facts, the movie did demonstrate that many people are still interested in ancient history. It became one of the highest-earning films of 2000 and won numerous awards including Academy Awards for Best Picture and Best Actor for Russell Crowe. Moreover, the film helped to renew interest in Roman history. Sales of biographies of historical Roman figures and of Marcus Aurelius's meditations increased noticeably in the years after the movie was released. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Family and society. Pliny the Younger, an upper-class Roman who rose to the position of governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor, wrote a letter to the Roman historian Tacitus, describing the death of his uncle, Pliny the Elder, as a result of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. At Tacitus's request, Pliny wrote another letter describing his own experiences during the massive eruption. Pliny, letter to Cornelius Tacitus. You say that the letter which I wrote to you at your request, describing the death of my uncle, has made you anxious to know not only the terrors, but also the distress I suffered while I remained behind at Misenum, a town near Pompeii. For many days previous there had been slight shocks of earthquake, which were not particularly alarming, because they are common enough in Campania. But on that night the shocks were so intense that everything round us seemed not only to be disturbed, but to be tottering to its fall.
My mother rushed into my bedchamber, just as I myself was getting up in order to arouse her, if she was still sleeping. It was now the first hour of the day, but the light was still faint and weak. Soon a black, fearful cloud of fiery vapor descended upon the earth and covered the whole bay. Then my mother prayed, entreated, and commanded me to fly as best I could, saying that I was young and could escape, while she was old and infirm, and would not fear to die, if only she knew that she had not been the cause of my death.
I replied that I would not save myself unless I could save her too, and so, after taking tight hold of her hand, I forced her to quicken her steps. She reluctantly obeyed, accusing herself for retarding my flight. Then the ashes began to fall, but not thickly. I looked back, and a dense blackness was rolling up behind us, which spread itself over the ground and followed like a torrent. "Let us turn aside," I said, "while we can still see, lest we be thrown down in the road and trampled on in the darkness by the thronging crowd." We were considering what to do, when the blackness of night overtook us, not that of a moonless or cloudy night, but the blackness of pent-up places which never see the light. You could hear the wailing of women, the screams of little children, and the shouts of men. Some were trying to find their parents, others their children, others their wives, by calling for them and recognizing them by their voices alone. Some were commiserating their own lot, others that of their relatives, while some again prayed for death in sheer terror of dying. Many were lifting up their hands to the gods, but more were declaring that now there were no longer any gods, and that this night would last forever, and be the end of all the world. Nor were there wanting those who added to the real perils by inventing new and false terrors, for some said that part of Misenum was in ruins and the rest in flames, and though the tale was untrue, it found ready believers. A gleam of light now appeared, which seemed to us not so much daylight as a token of the approaching fire. The latter remained at a distance, but the darkness came on again, and the ashes once more fell thickly and heavily. We had to keep rising and shaking the latter off us, or we should have been buried by them and crushed by their weight. At length the blackness became less dense, and dissipated, as it were, into smoke and cloud. Then came the real light of day. Our still trembling eyes saw that everything had been transformed, and covered with a deep layer of ashes, like snow. Making our way back to Misenum, we refreshed our bodies as best we could, and passed an anxious, troubled night, hovering between hope and fear. What do you think were the reactions of upper-class Romans to this event? How do you think lower-class Romans reacted? Comparative essay. Rulers and gods. Religion and philosophy. All of the world's earliest civilizations believed that there was a close relationship between rulers and gods. In Egypt, pharaohs were considered gods whose role was to maintain the order and harmony of the universe in their own kingdom. In the words of an Egyptian hymn, what is the king of Upper and Lower Egypt? He is a god by whose dealings one lives, the father and mother of all men, alone by himself, without an equal. In Mesopotamia, India, and China, rulers were thought to rule with divine assistance. Kings were often seen as rulers who derived their power from the gods and acted as the agents or representatives of the gods. In ancient India, rulers claimed to be representatives of the gods because they were descended from Manu, the first man who had been made a king by Brahman, the chief god. Many Romans believed that their success in creating an empire was a visible sign of divine favor. Their supposed connection to the gods also caused rulers to seek divine aid in the affairs of the world. This led to the art of divination, an organized method to discover the intentions of the gods. In Mesopotamian and Roman society, One form of divination involved the examination of the livers of sacrificed animals. Features seen in the livers were interpreted to foretell events to come. The Chinese used oracle bones to receive advice from supernatural forces that were beyond the power of human beings. Questions for the gods were scratched on turtle shells or animal bones, which were then exposed to fire. Shamans examined the resulting cracks on the surface of the shells or bones and interpreted their meaning as messages from supernatural forces. The Greeks divined the will of the gods by use of the oracle, a sacred shrine dedicated to a god or goddess who revealed the future in response to a question. Underlying all of these divinatory practices was a belief in a supernatural universe, that is, a world in which divine forces were in charge and on which humans were dependent for their own well-being. It was not until the scientific revolution of the modern world that many people began to believe in a natural world that was not governed by spiritual forces. What role did spiritual forces play in early civilizations? Opposing viewpoints. Roman authorities and a Christian on Christianity. Religion and philosophy. At first, Roman authorities were uncertain how to deal with the Christians. In the 2nd century, Christians were often viewed as harmless and yet were subject to persecution if they persisted in their beliefs. Pliny was governor of the province of Bithynia in northwestern Asia Minor, present-day Turkey. He wrote to the emperor for advice about how to handle people accused of being Christians. Trajan's response reflects the general approach toward Christians by the emperors of the 2nd century. The final selection is taken from Against Celsus, written about 246 by Origen of Alexandria. In it, Origen defended the value of Christianity against Celsus, a philosopher who had launched an attack on Christians and their teachings. An exchange between Pliny and Trajan. Pliny to Trajan. It is my custom, sir, to refer to you in all cases where I do not feel sure, for who can better direct my doubts or inform my ignorance? I have never been present at any legal examination of the Christians, and I do not know, therefore, what are the usual penalties passed upon them or the limits of those penalties, or how searching an inquiry should be made. In the meantime, this is the plan which I have adopted in the case of those Christians who have been brought before me. I ask them if they are Christians. If they say they are, then I repeat the question a second and a third time, warning them of the penalties it entails, and if they still persist, I order them to be taken away to prison. For I do not doubt that, whatever the character of the crime may be which they confess, their pertinacity and inflexible obstinacy certainly ought to be punished. As is usually the way, the very fact of my taking up this question led subsequently to a great increase of accusations, and a variety of cases were brought before me. So, I postponed my examination, and immediately consulted you. The matter seems to me worthy of your consideration, especially as there are so many people involved in the danger. Many persons of all ages, and of both sexes alike, are being brought into peril of their lives by their accusers, and the process will go on. For the contagion of this superstition has spread, not only through the free cities, but into the villages and the rural districts. Trajan to Pliny, you have adopted the proper course, my dear Pliny, in examining into the cases of those who have been denounced to you as Christians, for no hard and fast rule can be laid down to meet a question of such wide extent. The Christians are not to be hunted out. If they are brought before you and the offense is proved, they are to be punished, but with this reservation, that if anyone denies that he is a Christian and makes it clear that he is not, by offering prayers to our deities, then he is to be pardoned because of his recantation, however suspicious his past conduct may have been. But pamphlets published anonymously must not carry any weight whatever, no matter what the charge may be, for they are not only a precedent of the very worst type, but they are not in consonance with the spirit of our age. Origen, against Celsus. Celsus says that Christians perform their rites and teach their doctrines in secret, and they do this with good reason to escape the death penalty that hangs over them.
He compares the danger to the risks encountered for the sake of philosophy as by Socrates. I reply to this that in Socrates' cases the Athenians at once regretted what they had done, and cherished no grievance against him. But in the case of the Christians, the Roman Senate, the contemporary emperors, the army, and the relatives of believers fought against the gospel and would have hindered it, and it would have been defeated by the combined force of so many unless it had overcome and risen above the opposition by divine power, so that it has conquered the whole world that was conspiring against it. He also ridicules our teachers of the gospel who try to elevate the soul in every way to the creator of the universe. He compares them, Christians, to the most obtuse yokels, as if they call children quite in infancy and women to evil practices, telling them to leave their father and teachers and to follow them.
But let Celsus tell us how we make women and children leave noble and sound teaching, and call them to wicked practices. But he will not be able to prove anything of any kind against us. On the contrary, we deliver women from licentiousness and from perversion caused by their associates, while we make boys self-controlled when they come to the age of puberty and burn with desires for sexual pleasure, showing them not only the disgrace of their sins, but also what a state these pleasures produce in the souls of bad men, and what penalties they will suffer and how they will be punished. What were Pliny's personal opinions of Christians? Why was he willing to execute them? What was Trajan's response, and what were its consequences for the Christians? What major points did Origen make about the benefits of the Christian religion? Why did the Roman authorities consider these ideas dangerous to the Roman state? Comparative illustration. Politics and government. Emperors, West and East. Two great empires with strong central governments dominated much of the ancient world, the Roman Empire in the West and the Har Empire in the East. Shown here are two emperors from these empires. The Roman Emperor Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138, was the third of the 5 good emperors. He had been adopted by the Emperor Trajan to serve as his successor. Hadrian was a strong and intelligent ruler who took his responsibilities seriously. Between 121 and 132, he visited all of the provinces in the empire. Liu Bang came from the peasant class, but through his military prowess, he defeated all rivals in the civil wars that followed the death of the first emperor of Qin. Liu Bang, who is known historically by his title of Hagou, was the first emperor of the Ha dynasty, which ruled China for 400 years. He won the support of his subjects by reducing their tax burden. He was also responsible for bringing China back under central control but was killed in a frontier battle in 195 BCE. What similarities do you see in the lives of these two rulers? Chapter Summary. Sometime in the 8th century BCE, a group of Latin-speaking people built a small community called Rome on the Tiber River in Italy. Between 509 and 264 BCE, this city expanded and brought almost all of Italy under its control. During this time of conquest, Rome also developed the political institutions of a republic ruled by an aristocratic oligarchy. Between 264 and 133 BCE, Rome expanded to the west and east and became master of the Mediterranean Sea and its surrounding territories, creating one of the largest empires in antiquity. In the 2nd century BCE, the conservative, traditional values of Rome declined as affluence and individualism increased. After 133 BCE, Rome's republican institutions proved inadequate for the task of ruling an empire, and after a series of bloody civil wars, Augustus created a new order that established a Roman imperial state. The Roman Empire experienced a lengthy period of peace and prosperity between 14 and 180. During this Pax Romana, trade flourished and the provinces were governed efficiently. In the course of the 3rd century, however, the empire came near to collapse due to invasions, civil wars, and economic decline. At the same time, a new religion, Christianity, was spreading throughout the empire and slowly gained acceptance. The response to the crises of the 3rd century and the rise of Christianity gradually brought a transformation of the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries. Although the emperors Diocletian and Constantine brought new life to the so-called late empire, their efforts only shored up the empire temporarily. Beginning in 395, the empire divided into western and eastern parts,